I think part of being an intellectual is being perpetually, profoundly dissatisfied with your own ignorance, and then being perpetually, profoundly dissatisfied with the ignorance of your own society, the role of ignorance in the shaping of and functioning of your own society. And that may or may not exhibit itself in a really directly political way. I think there's something almost inevitably socio-political. There's some kind of social commentary or social critique that's going to come out of that. I think holding oneself to that standard, inevitably leads to social frustrations, because you live in a society where people still, we can use any example, but people still literally cut the foreskin off a baby's penis to act out a ritual, in the Old Testament. It's ridiculous. There are 1,000 possible examples of the absurdities in our society. Once you're of that character where you hold yourself to that higher standard and you struggle with your own ignorance. So what is the point? One answer, you've heard from me before on this YouTube channel. The point is who I am. The point is who you want to be and who you want to become, right? And on some level, we all know that. I mean, it's shallow and it's deep at the same time. Right. Like what you read and what you care about and what kind of difference you're trying to make in the world, these things, they become who you are and you become them in a very real sense.
Exactly.
If you sit on the couch and watch football and drink beer after work, you become a sitting on the couch football watching motherfucker. That's who you are. It's not, you can't put that aside and say, oh no, that's not who I really am. That's
my true self.
You can't say that's not who I really am. That's just what I do in my free time. No,
you become what you do in your free time.
That is who you are, right? Or you could say your free time is exactly.
That's really hard to face up.
That's That's well, I think that's also what haunts intellectuals, right? I think that's part of what haunts you. So I mean, why try to learn Cree? It's not like I today can speak the Cree language fluently. Why try to learn Chinese? And why, within that, why care about Chinese politics and history in the kind of critical way that I do? Well, guess what? I get to be me. That's the final outcome, is that it's not that this is something I do, that this is who I am. This video has been a long time coming. I got a question many months ago from James. I'm just using first names. James is a longtime supporter on Patreon and someone who's also a vegan involved in baking. And I would guess in response to some video or another in which I used the word in passing, he asked me, what does it mean to you to be an intellectual? Or what is the meaning of being an intellectual in 2018? I got my best girl, Melissa, here off camera. If you're wondering what I'm looking at, it's not like I'm looking at notes I've written down from earlier or something. I'm not looking at my script. Okay, I have like 6 different things to say here, and none of them are logically linked together. So one of the first things I have to say, I was chatting with T-Cat recently, and he meant this in a totally positive way. But he said, jokingly, Eisel, stop calling yourself an autodidact. He said that's one of those laughable things that makes everyone cringe. Like if you call yourself an autodidact, he said, this was his joke or what he was saying, he said, it's like calling yourself an entrepreneur. Now, I get the joke he's making, but this is one of those things. Wearing a cowboy hat isn't camp and it isn't a costume if you're actually a cowboy. If you actually work on a ranch with cows, you know what I mean? Yeah. Wearing spurs on your boots, it's not a Halloween costume if that's what you actually are. And, I get the joke he's trying to make. Like, there are people who call themselves an entrepreneur, maybe especially on YouTube, maybe especially within the vegan movement, or maybe especially just maybe in fitness or something. Maybe he's thinking of some other, I guess that's true. The fitness YouTubers, they make an ebook or they say they're giving Skype coaching and they call themselves an entrepreneur. Okay, once in a while, people using that word it's maybe cringeworthy. But what about the people who really are entrepreneurs, or people who really aspire to be, people who are studying hard and working hard? Because that's really how they see their their career path. And what the reason I mention this, though, is the really sort of snide undercurrent, which I think prevents a lot of people from even thinking through what it means to be an intellectual, whether or not it's something they aspired to be in the past or present or future. Because for a lot of people, it's maybe something you toyed with as a teenager, and it's something you come back to later in life when you have some more time and leisure or something, after a period of desperately trying to make rent money. You know, this culture that exists on the internet and to some extent in real life of, you know, kind of denigrating people for any pretensions, you know, they may have. And on the other side of that, you know, okay, look, we've all seen movies that depict people who have ridiculous potential. Pardon me, people who have ridiculous pretensions and become the butt of the joke, you know, in the movie and what have you. But having ambition and having the vulnerability to say openly that you have that ambition, you know, whatever it is, you know, it's not such a terrible thing for someone to want to be a poet. You know, should they really be the butt of every joke? And, you know, at the same time, there are so many pretensions in our society we're all supposed to take, you know, so tremendously seriously. I mean, white American culture is like that. The idea of the dream and don't puncture someone's dream and so on. There are certain forms of, affected innocence, you know, of being a dreamer that are culturally valorized and protected. And there are others that are always kind of, you know, the butt of a joke. So look, just to dispense with that example, you know, briefly, when I say I was an autodidact in learning Laotian, the Lao language, I mean I had no teacher. I had no school. I had no college. I went to the library. In some cases I did in effect like make my own resources and textbooks. I can remember going to one library where they had photocopies of handouts that were used in United Nations refugee camps, you know, for the Lao language education materials, and looking at that and being like, okay, what's useful here? And French colonial dictionaries, the language in the French colonial period, you know, Laotian to French, and then figuring out the writing system had changed from that period to the modern period, and figuring out how the spelling system worked and documents from different eras. I was an autodidact in every possible sense of the word. Maybe, you know, for you, maybe for a TCAT watching this, or for someone else watching this, you know, maybe you think it's a joke for someone to call themselves, an autodidact. Maybe sometimes it is ridiculous when people call themselves a cowboy, you know, okay? But what about when we're talking about people who actually wear that hat or wear spurs on their boots for a reason? You know, at some point, the kind of endless cycle of, undermining other people's, you know, ambitions. That's what we're talking about, not pretensions, but ambitions. You know, to no end. At some point, it has to stop. At some point, we have to start living in earnest and living without, you know, really irony for the sake of irony. You know, I say this as someone who certainly enjoys. I don't know. I used to joke that, you know, irony is a force as inevitable, as irresistible as gravity in the universe. You know, I laugh at myself a great deal. I laugh at others, at least here on YouTube from time to time. But yeah, there's a real question of what does it mean to be an intellectual. So anyway, I'm going to ask my girlfriend about this because I think her perspective is totally different. Something else I want to say right at the start of the video. One of the 6 or so disjointed thoughts I have about this is very sincere and for me runs deep. I think part of being an intellectual is being perpetually, profoundly dissatisfied with your own ignorance. And then being perpetually, profoundly dissatisfied with the ignorance of your own society, the role of ignorance in the shaping of and functioning of your own society. Mm-hmm. And that may or may not exhibit itself in a really directly political way. I think there's something almost inevitably socio-political. There's some kind of social commentary or social critique that's going to come out of that. But, you know this about me, the way that I'm constantly aware of my own ignorance and gaps in my knowledge. And it's not that I'm self-censoring, but whenever I say things to you that's really outside of my area of expertise, or it's based on one thing I've read, I say, look, this is only based on one or two things I've read, or this is whatever. There's a self-critical aspect of being aware of the limits of my own ignorance and struggling against them sincerely. Again, it's not a joke. It's not ironic. It's not a meme war. It's not the kind of muck that the internet seems to rake in, of really sincerely struggling. Like when I just finally read about the history of the English Civil War, when will I get a chance to study half the things I feel I need to study in that kind of struggle?
Yeah.
And then holding oneself to that standard, inevitably leads to social frustrations, because you live in a society where people still, we can use any example, but people still literally cut the foreskin off a baby's penis to act out a ritual, in the Old Testament. It's ridiculous. There are 1,000 possible examples of the absurdities in our society. Once you're of that character where you hold yourself to that higher standard and you struggle with your own ignorance.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this is really answering your question. I was reminded of somebody from my high school. In a way, he had this same ambition to fill in the gaps of his knowledge. And he really was earnest in trying to be a painter. His paintings were, and to be a poet. I think he just was an artist in general. He was an artistic type. And he at one point was trying to be a rapper. So I mean, but he was really, earnest in all of these ambitions, and it was sad for me when people would make fun of him or something, because he was just, and it didn't bother him. He was so confident that he could just brush it off and continue with whatever he was working on. But for somebody else, it is hard to see that drive being made fun of. Yeah. And I think that is a problem in our society.
As compared to the way he would have been received if he was putting his ambitions into playing football. Yeah. Or if he was putting his ambitions into just playing video games, or
exactly,
earning money, or joining the army,
But yeah, I think at the root of this particular example, and also for me too, it is just a dissatisfaction with society, and feeling and also just dissatisfaction with your own level of knowledge on any topic.
Well, look, I was going to say, you're mentioning, I think, a stereotype of intellectuals, which it makes sense, but falls apart under examination. Being an intellectual is completely separate from being an artist. I mean, I think if anyone pauses to think about it, it's obvious. But, is Harvey Weinstein an intellectual? There are all kinds of examples of artists who are not intellectuals, who are people who've devoted their lives to creative arts, whether it's painting or filmmaking or music or what have you. And they're not intellectuals. So it can't be that it has anything to do with being an artist. They're just saying they're two separate things. I totally see you can be an intellectual, and for that reason, you're in the arts. Yeah. You can be an intellectual, and for that reason, you're a scholar or a researcher. I mean, there are all kinds of things you might put that impulse into. But I think that's sort of mistake number one at a shallow level.
I see.
There's I think that the misconception I grew up with was just the idea that because someone is left wing, because someone's a political activist, therefore they're an intellectual. And again, I think that's misleading in the same sort of way. Someone may be an intellectual, and then for that reason, they get involved with some political cause or another. But of course, what I was going to learn in life, starting as a child, was that the vast majority of people who were left-wing in Canada, this white English-speaking Canada, were not intellectuals. I would say the majority of them learned to kind of pass themselves off as intellectuals when necessary, to have some of the affectations, because politically it is more fashionable for the left wing to pretend to be intellectuals than it is for conservatives or the far right wing or something. But again, these are really two very separate things. So look, for you coming up, I don't think this has been a question you've had to answer. And I mean, you didn't grow up in a family where you were expected to be an intellectual. You weren't educated in an educational system where there was any question of anyone being an intellectual. You know, again,
no, but I mean,
yeah.
maybe I am falling into the same pattern of mistaking artistry with intelligence.
Well, that's what I think it's worth talking about, though. We're going, yeah.
Well,
it's not that easy to pin down what we really mean by it. Yeah.
Yeah, when I would sometimes certain people, when I would tell them that I was getting my my undergraduate in English, they assumed that I wanted to be a creative writer. They assumed that I wanted to write novels. Yeah. And they kind of scoffed at that. But, you know, that wasn't ever my intention with getting the degree. And I had to just explain, no, I'm not. I'm not a poet. I don't plan to write books. Or if I did write a book, it would be a nonfiction type of book. So anyway, that was my. Once I got into college, it became more of a thing in my life. But no, I wasn't expected to be an intellectual. I was just supposed to perform well in school, get good grades so that I could go to a good college and start a good career and make money. Right. That was really the goal in learning. Right. Learning to be somebody who could support themselves.
Well, we've just talked about, for like the 10th time this year, Aristotle's philosophy of education, too. Mm-hmm. So I lectured repeatedly in China about Aristotle's philosophy of education in the university classes I was teaching. So now I was just reading the primary source again. And I mean, Aristotle has this idea that, well, it's similar to the much used phrase around here that the unexamined life is not worth living. But he points out that the purpose of education, in his view, is not any particular skill or ability. It's not earning money. It's not winning competitions. The ultimate purpose of education is the enjoyment of leisure. And I'll come back and say a little bit more about what he means about leisure. That's why it comes up in this situation. But you get this sense, this part isn't that directly argued, that by becoming more and more educated, you're in effect using your leisure at a higher and higher level of refinement or quality or sophistication, and that is the purpose of education. But, you know, the actual Greek term used for leisure is scholi. And he explains himself, when he says leisure, he doesn't mean playing games, he doesn't mean wasting time, he doesn't mean relaxing. You know, when he explains at moderate length that when he talks about leisure, he's talking about something that fundamentally, you know, expands your mind. But I would say again, what Aristotle's describing is not being an intellectual. And it's very significant when he illustrates this. So the main example we have him discussing at length is the significance of the study of music. Melissa spent many years studying music. Yeah. And he sets down, look, from Aristotle's perspective, when you study music, it should only be basically you're learning to play instruments in order to increase your appreciation of music, exercise your soul, and what have you. He says you should never gain any technical skill in music. You should never participate in competitions. You should never perform before an audience or become a professional, because then, he says, you'll be perverted by trying to impress the crowd. See, this is also an interesting thing about being an intellectual, right? The idea of the intellectual is not that it's someone like a stand-up comedian doing whatever will make the audience laugh. That it's not, you know, an intellectual may be a stand-up comedian or maybe a filmmaker or something, but that they're not doing something commercial. They're not doing what for the audience. But what are they doing it for? It's very easy to say that negatively. Oh, this isn't for the audience. Right? But then what is it for is what we're...
Well, growing up, you know, I was taught that anything like that would be a waste of time. You know, just doing something. When I learned to play music, the first thing that I did was perform in front of an audience, and I was in competitions, solo competitions, and also... you know, competing to get to the top chair, competing just with other schools, like our whole orchestra would be competing against schools. And
Aristotle would be flabbergasted.
And I did, indeed, you know, the main goal was to learn technique. So that is interesting to hear that aspect of it. And like just doing something for
So you know that this is part of the founding idea of the Olympics also. I've pointed this out to you before the Olympics became commercialized. Was that it was not supposed to be a competition between professionals, but between amateurs, the idea of the gentleman amateur. This ran through European philosophy of what it meant to be an aristocrat, partly drawing on Aristotle, partly drawing on things, the idea that the aristocrat is the sort of ultimate dilettante. He doesn't become a great painter or a great musician, but he's a patron of all the arts. He learns them all to some extent. He appreciates them all to some extent. He can play the violin, but he doesn't, he's not a journeyman, a musician or something. This idea of self-cultivation, but, but remaining a dilettante, never going pro, and never becoming commercial and so on.
Right. Well,
so that's a big part of the European tradition, partly directly as a result of Aristotle.
Yeah. I mean, I know the topic of this video is not about music education, but that is the trend that I saw when growing up, that, it's this big focus on competing and performing the best. But then typically most students, when they're done with high school, they never pick up their instruments again.
That's right.
And they don't use it in this dilettante way.
That's right. But I mean, look, this is also true of our education in biology, or education in math. For most of us, you never pick up a biology book, and biology isn't.
No.
So that gets at the question of what is the function of education, et cetera, right?
Right.
Yeah. And I just say, but the definition I proposed at the start of this video too, I think it is possible to be an intellectual within biology or within the pure sciences or what have you. I think you'd be applying the same underlying profound dissatisfaction to a critique of what's going on in, the establishment of biomedical research, or and obviously to your frustrations with your own ignorance or what have you, than having that play out in one way or another. Yeah. So look, in what context in 2018 would anyone even describe themselves as an intellectual? So I mean, almost the only time this comes up in my life now is people on the internet and people who are really not even in a position to say this, telling me that I'm not an intellectual.
Yeah, saying that you're a pseudo-intellectual.
Right.
Yeah, I've seen that.
See this kind of insult. And, I mean, sir, but in what context would I even say that I am one? Like, how can it even come up in our society? I mean, sorry, autodidact is different. I have to tell people, no, I taught myself this language. I became a scholar in this field or that field with, no expertise, with no outside source of authority or formal education. Sure. Yeah. Being an autodidact comes up, and normally it's kind of a bad thing. It's as opposed to being a formally credentialed person in the field or what have you. And not all fields am I autodidact. Cree and Ojibwe, I formally studied Cree and Ojibwe in a university in Canada. There was a chalkboard, there were exams, I had completely formal education in that field. So, I have all my credentials in Cree and Ojibwe. But in some fields, I was an autodidact. But in saying, that I'm an intellectual, look, this came up, totally different topic of conversation. But, when I look at people like Durian Ryder, people like Joe Best, living in Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and so on, I've said in passing, I don't really judge these guys by their sex lives. I'm not that sex negative, But from my perspective, they're scumbags just because of the life they're living out there, period. It's not that I think they should be living in celibacy. It's not that I would respect their lives if they were doing the same thing, but in celibacy. For me, sex is not the issue there. And when I was living there, I did ride a bicycle. I lived a life in some ways on the surface that was similar, but I was literally riding my bicycle from the archives to the gym. I mean, I was working out and I had a bicycle. I was doing manuscript research, historical research, political research. I can say humanitarian research. I was actively applying for jobs in the humanitarian field. If you're not rich, if you don't have money to put on the table, spend a lot more time looking for humanitarian work than doing it. And I mean, again, all this time, there was this deep, dissatisfaction. So I mean, look, even within that, I mean, I can give a long list of examples. But, I remember I was talking to another, actually, this guy was a journalist, but I could say another researcher, about the history of the French Empire in that part of the world. And he disagreed with something I'd written, something I'd published. And the claim was actually about what happened in the land battles of a certain period of France conquering and trying to control that part of the world. And he said, no, this isn't true, and so on. And I said, oh, well, how do you know? And I was able to say very readily how I knew what I knew and ask him about it. And I remember he had the honesty to just say he realized only after I challenged him that actually all of his sources were French government propaganda. He said, wow, you know what? I've actually never seen anything written from the Laotian perspective or the Thai perspective. And he just folded. He realized that, there was a difference there. So look, as absurd as it sounds, not only is it possible to work in something like the academic study of history and not be an intellectual, it's common. It's not just possible to do humanitarian work in Laos and not be an intellectual. The vast majority are not. It's not, it's not just possible to be an artist and not be an intellectual. The vast majority are. So when we're looking for the trait, name the trait. What is the trait that makes someone intellectual? This is my way of putting it. Now I made a couple other notes. I mean, okay, so yeah, I forgot about this. I mean, the other question I raised, this comes up in all kinds of contexts, is the issue of not making excuses for yourself. And I mean, this is almost just saying the same thing, but inside out. That you're not making excuses for yourself, and you're not making excuses for others. I think that's what it leads to. What does it mean? So, if you get an A+ in history, you can get an A+ repeating complete mythology about history. I mean, you can just get an A+. Oh, okay. Let's pick a not too provocative. We were talking recently about Thomas Jefferson. So you can write you can get an A+ in high school or university saying that Thomas Jefferson was the greatest president of the United States. Mm-hmm. What about First Nations? What about American Indians? What about the indigenous people? I mean, I think exactly the point is, you're not making excuses for yourself. You're not making the society you live in. If you're a real intellectual, you're not going to be satisfied with reading a textbook that just says Thomas Jefferson's the greatest president for reasons X, Y, and Z, or even writing your essay repeating this kind of propaganda and getting the A+. You're inevitably going to have that dissatisfaction. You're going to hold yourself to a higher standard. And then when you find out that other side of the story, now you're going to be looking at your history professor, you're going to be looking at your school, you're going to be looking at the political system in the country you live in, and you're going to be holding it to a higher standard also. It's that you're not making excuses for yourself, and you're maybe not accepting the socially sanctioned or socially celebrated excuses that exist in your own side. I think this is one of the.
Where do you think that comes from? I mean, because I don't know. Can you expect a kid who goes through education, the same education system, who has parents that don't really emphasize independent thought, like independent learning? I don't know.
No, look, it's a great question.
Yeah.
But I don't have an answer. Mm-hmm. We heard a totally laughable character in Mendham. We didn't have that clip on the show, but you remember he broke down at one point and he just said, "That's why I can never be happy." It was in the middle of him ranting against my video.
Yeah, we lost that clip somehow. It's just...
But look. I mean, to think that's part of it. I mean, I think part of it is innate. I think part of it is character. Yeah. Schopenhauer likes to say, "Villa non discitur." You can't teach wanting. I mean, I think part of it is like, being rapacious, being uncompromising, being and being very frustrated and unhappy. If you can just believe the socially sanctioned myth like everyone else, if you can just go on eating yogurt and believing Thomas Jefferson was a great man, and you're not questioning, well, what about slavery and the extinction of indigenous peoples and their languages and forced assimilation and so on? Well, yeah. You're not thinking about, maybe there is a kind of happiness, but it's exactly that character of the unexamined life is not worth living and getting out and examining it.
Right. Yeah. I guess that's more explicitly the excuse making.
Right.
Like,
look, most people love excuses. I mean, that's fucking middle age in a nutshell. Is where you have your comfort blanket of excuses wrapped around you at all times.
Yeah. It's true. Yeah,
it's one of the reasons teenagers are normally seen as more inclined to be intellectuals. I think they just haven't gotten used to, the excuse making.
Right. Well, I remember as a teen, as an adolescent and teenager, being very dissatisfied, very unhappy. But I didn't use that in a positive way. In this way, I put my focus into performing well in school, and that was really how that energy was put forward. But yeah. Anyway.
I mean, look, I think there's another question of, well, but you didn't become an intellectual. I'm sorry. I mean, that's the reality. If you're going to become an intellectual, it's starting now. I'm just saying. I think that's the other thing implicitly here. I mean, sorry. I mean, you weren't an intellectual as a teenager, nor in university.
No, that's what I'm saying.
But I mean, yeah, I think that's
like
one of the reasons
performing well in school is getting A's on your tests,
I know.
Doing well in competitions and stuff.
One of the questions I'd ask is it possible to be an intellectual and be a conformist? And I think, depending on which society you're looking at, the answer might be yes. But, in almost any society we're talking about, it's inevitable that being an intellectual leads to your being a nonconformist. Because as soon as you start asking these kinds of questions, as soon as you become this kind of uncompromising character, you say, wow, this whole society is built on lies. This society is built on compromises I can't make, I can't abide by. You become this kind of irascible figure. I mean, it is a little bit like Socrates' image of the gadfly. But the problem is, with Socrates' image, the gadfly bites the horse. Mm-hmm. And I'm pointing out, the intellectual, you bite yourself, much more than your discomfort. In other words, it's your own misery, it's your own discomfort, on a very, very fundamental level.
Yeah.
But, if you live in a radically better society than the one we live on, if you live in a society that's not built on genocide and lies about genocide, that's not built on people eating yogurt and lying about yogurt and cutting the foreskins off of the penises of babies, if it's not built on all these ridiculous lies. So, but even for the United States in your generation, I mean, your whole life, the United States has been at war with countries most people can't spell properly. There's been constant war of the most meaningless, unforgivable kind. And that stuff bothered me deeply, Canada's involvement and everything else. People talk about the Vietnam generation. Well, your generation is the Afghanistan and, Iraq generation. Some people may just care less. But I mean, those questions, the ethical issues raised. Sorry, I remember. Look, I just tell you honestly, but I mean, I remember. I this is also part of being an intellectual that I did the research. I was incredibly disturbed the first time I read about the United States' use of depleted uranium as shielding, both as bullets and as armor. In war. That was incredibly, disturbing to me. Now, I did research on it. Obviously not that much research. Sorry, I'm not a chemist or something. But I looked into why the Army was using that, and I realized, look, even though this has some unbelievably negative ecological side effects, you know what? I'd make the same decision because it's about saving lives. It's about, ultimately stopping a bullet that's going to go through a tank or something, I just say that sometimes that same dissatisfaction. But still, I can remember my sense of horror that started me looking into that,
But didn't you have didn't you have somebody that you could emulate this?
Sure, go on. It's a great question.
No, because I thought the way to better myself, or
right.
to be, I don't know how to say this without sounding like cocky or something, but to prove to other people that I was more intelligent than them. I was like, I'm gonna work my ass off and get into the best school in the state and stuff. I didn't know that I could put that energy into something else, and I think my life probably would have been better. So.
I'd give you a hug and a kiss, but you're on the other side of the table.
Anyway, yeah, I'm just saying. Yeah.
No, look, I mean,
no role models. No role models.
No, it's a great topic. I mean, in some ways, it's the shallowest thing in the world. What does this label mean? To be an intellectual, or and I'm asking this at a time in 2018 when almost nobody uses the label, and when it is laughed at. So Sam Harris has tried to revive the label and talks about the intellectual dark web and this and it is laughable. It is worth scoffing at. It is worth ridiculing. It's true. I mean, like I say, are you wearing a cowboy hat because you're actually a cowboy? Or is it dressed up for Halloween? Some people are real intellectuals and some are not.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to get down to the question of what that mark is. Sure.
Right. Exactly.
But I mean, what can I tell you? No, I didn't have these role models. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I mean, you know, sure, other traits you have to have is that you're not easily impressed, you're not easily overwhelmed, that you don't, sign up for the kind of excuses and half-truths,
Right.
People are giving you.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, I knew most kids didn't even, like, read the textbooks.
Right.
So, like,
right.
I was like, no, I'm going to sit down and read the freaking textbook. I'm going to read all the books that are assigned.
Yeah. Right.
Right, but I don't know if that actually helped in any way.
Sure, you said this, this to me off camera, but you never or almost ever went to the library and got other sources that challenged the textbook.
No.
You didn't get to sources that proved the textbook was wrong.
I didn't.
Right.
No.
And that's what I did. Right.
I didn't want to go against the rules.
I was really that's what I did.
In line.
That's what I did even in theater. Even when I was in the theater and studying acting and plays. And, not politics, not directly. Of course, I was only interested in it because of politics. I was getting books out of the library that challenged what was being taught in the classroom and in the textbook.
Yeah.
There's a different approach to that. Even for that. So, of course, I'm looking at the history of Japan. But it starts with a simple question. So people talk about the history of Japan, but nobody wants to talk about that Japan used to have another island that's now part of Russia.
Yeah.
What's being covered up there? Well, it turns out I discovered this whole massacre, this whole history going back more than 300 years. That's really interesting. And that really but nobody taught me that. That wasn't in any textbook or any nothing. So that's just me being dissatisfied with what is being taught and looking out, for that stuff. And when I did history and politics in Sri Lanka, it's an obvious example, but it's also worth mentioning. I met a man who was born and raised in Sri Lanka. He was Hindu, and even though he was a critic of the caste system, so this is caste, C-A-S-T-E. Caste system is a system of ethnic and economic inequality. It's hard to explain. It's similar to apartheid or what have you, but it's a traditional form of both racism and classism in Indian culture. So this guy I met, he lived his whole life in Sri Lanka, and he was very much aware of the caste system within Hinduism. And when I started talking to him about the caste system within Buddhism, within Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka, he was just shocked, and he looked at me and he said, "But there is no caste system within Buddhism." Again, I was involved in Buddhism. That might be a lie. Lots of people, that's like saying there's no racism within Buddhism, but it's a very particular form of racism that really exists and really has history and depth, and that you can prove the existence of. Yeah. I was never the kind of person who just say, "Oh, that's good news. I'll close that book."
Yeah,
no, I'm someone who sees that and says something wrong here. I'm not someone. So Thailand was very proud that they had no slavery and no caste system. And of course, if you really study the history of Thailand, you find out exactly about their history of slavery and so on.
Yeah.
So you find out how brutal and terrible the history was. I was never like, "Oh, that's good news. So history of Thailand equals good. History of Europe equals bad. Case closed." No. Or Sri Lanka equals good. India equals bad. No. So with any of those things, with no prompting and no role model, there's this dissatisfaction with my own ignorance, dissatisfaction with the role of ignorance and what I'm seeing. And that, that leads me,
I'm not saying I didn't grow up with lies.
Right.
I grew up with a lot of lies. But, to the extent that they were lies that I think it probably took me a longer time to tell that they were lies. Then, you grew up with a communist family, communist parents. And from what you've said, it sounds like from a young age you could decipher that these were just ridiculous statements. And I guess maybe that's part of it, like not trusting in what you hear, because I think I was programmed to trust in what I and think that what I'm being taught is right.
And you've seen me just in the last couple of days, even with Aristotle. There's a real sense in which I'm not believing what the translator tells me, or I'm not, what I mean? You've seen the way I interrogate the source, and then I find another article, and then, this guy's kind of lying about some things. You've seen the way, even with something as mainstream as philosophy of Aristotle, I'm kind of interrogating the text all the time. I'm questioning what does the author really mean, and to what extent is this being misrepresented by the translator or this edition or what have you. So I'm like that. all the time with anything.
Yeah.
But look, so so she mentioned I was raised by communists, but I'm not communist. But my parents certainly raised me to be a communist, and I rejected that.
Yeah.
I think there is something to be said when you grow up with one set of values or one set of truth claims being propounded inside the home, and then you see them being refuted outside the home again and again. I think that does have a certain effect on people. And the vast majority of people even just grow up Muslim or Catholic, in the Western world, grow up with that. I'm sorry, but look, just let's say you grow up in Los Angeles and your parents tell you that nobody should have sex before marriage.
Yeah. Right.
It's shallow, but it's deep at the same time, right? You grow up with seeing that. I don't think that makes you into an intellectual. I don't think it's the same impetus or impulse. I mean, I think there's something there worth talking about. I do. Maybe it makes you into a nihilist. Maybe it makes you into a relativist.
Right.
Maybe there's some kind of...
It makes you question what you've been told.
The values inside the household and the values outside of the household being incompatible or one refuting the other, I think that's a major part of the modern experience. That wasn't part of the feudal medieval experience. But even just people who grew up with mainstream Muslim parents or conservative Catholic parents, it's not just communists who grow up with that. Where you say, wow, so my father thought Joseph Stalin was a great guy. My mother has literally said that she regarded Mao Zedong massacring people in Tibet was a good thing. That's what's inside the household. And then even just what you see on newspapers or what your school teachers say or something is kind of, but I don't think it makes you intellectual,
Yeah, but I guess the importance of it is that it makes you skeptical, and having somebody that has his influence on you to be skeptical could lead to that trait.
But my parents were not teaching me to be skeptical.
Yeah.
It's exactly. They were teaching me to be dogmatic.
Yeah.
As I said before, I said I could say a little bit more about it, but I mean, okay, I said earlier that being left-wing or even being just hyper-political, being someone who cares a lot about politics, doesn't make you an intellectual. I would here combine that with the fact that being an expert doesn't make you an intellectual. So in Laos, or Southeast Asia, but this could be anywhere. This could be in Canada. This could be anywhere. If you're an expert in sewage treatment, you're an expert in pipes and plumbing, you can do great work all over the world in the humanitarian sector, refugee camps, third world countries need this kind of expert. And I dealt with experts in a million fields, but in many fields, but you can meet someone who's an X-ray technician doing humanitarian work, but you can also meet people, you can meet someone who's an expert in facphysics. And they're like, yeah, they're there, they would normally be Germans. They'd say, yeah, they decided to come out to Southeast Asia and really help the university in a third world country improve their teaching of physics and their physics experts. Yeah. You met people doing that, okay? But being an expert is very often dogmatic. Those people will come to Laos and they say, hey, I know the true physics. I know the true way to teach physics. I'm an expert in the science of physics. I'm here to show you what's done. They may genuinely know. They know sewage treatment, and they're here to show you the right way to set up your sewage treatment and so on.
No,
so I'm not using super culturally relativistic examples here, right? Mm-hmm. But they're not there to learn. They're not there to question. They're not going to do any of the doubt or self-doubt I've described, right? So I mean, some may. Individually, you may meet one who's an intellectual. But being an expert that way, if anything, tends to dogmatic thinking and, preaching out of this kind of certainty and not what I'm proposing here as being the main issue of having this, self-critical mentality that leads to being critical of society in general. Yeah. And I would say that is very much the attitude of hardcore left-wingers, communists, socialists, and just dogmatic left-wing people. They feel that they are an expert in the suffering of the poor, revolution, economics. A lot of them feel they're expert. They know something about economics, or they know something about political conditions and progressive politics. And then they're just dogmatically informing other people of what that is.
Yeah,
it's not going to be the same kind of self-criticism and social criticism, the same kind of deep dissatisfaction with your own ignorance and the role of ignorance in society around you.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that, look, I mean, like my parents' model, the ideal of being a left-winger was to basically be bourgeois, be a member of the, you know, middle class, not to be poor, you know, right. But then to go out and organize labor unions, to go on strike, you know. I'm so, you know, this was their model. Obviously, it's really from the 1930s or earlier. You know, it's a totally different idea of the world. The idea is that there are these poor, ignorant laborers who are working in factories and mines who have a much lower level of education than you do. And what you need to do is go out there and inform them they're oppressed. They're so oppressed, they don't even realize they're oppressed. Yeah. And you organize them into a revolt or a revolution or a general strike or what have you, right? Mm-hmm. And look, I mean, when I was in Laos, I was learning all the time. When I was dealing with the Korean Ojibwe and so on too, it's like, you know, that's why I say I wasn't trying to convert those people to veganism. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, you know, I'm not arriving here as an expert, you know, to deliver I totally to you. See what you're saying. I'm not delivering you the gospel of something I'm certain in and devout in and committed to. You know, no, I'm really there as an intellectual. I'm there with gnawing, you know, self-doubt. I met, this was an example I didn't appreciate that well at the time. I met a young woman, and I think she was getting her PhD in social geography, so all-purpose social science. And she said that, you know, they did a unit looking at prostitution in, I think, Thailand and Laos, in that region. And all of them, they were all female. She said a lot of social sciences are majority female. But she said all the graduate students were female. And they came into class, having done the reading, or came into the seminar, and they were all kind of starting off the seminar saying, oh, this is, you know, this is an obscenity, this is a humanitarian disaster, this is terrible situation of prostitution in towns. And so each of them got to speak briefly. And the professor said, okay, now we're going to do a comparison. Everyone get out a blank sheet of paper. We're going to put up, you know, wipe the chalkboard clean. Each of the things you just complained about, is it better or worse in Thailand than it is in Germany? And all of them were ashamed by the end of it, because exactly the things they'd complained about, they actually had to accept that the situation was worse by their own criteria. Yeah. They had been hypocrites, and the situation was actually worse in Germany than it was in Thailand. Now, look, I mean, at the time, I didn't really see the anecdote this way. I didn't kind of get it. When you think about it deeply, this is kind of the missionary mentality versus, you know, really being an intellectual and really questioning. Because it should lead you to question. I mean, you know, being in Thailand led me to question, you know, things about my own society, things about my own assumptions, things about what do I know and what do I not know. You know, I mean, I think that is the point, is exactly to be always living on that productive razor's edge of doubt, where, you know, doubt becomes a cutting tool to cut away at your own ignorance and cut away at the false assumptions of the society you live in, that you've been raised in, and so on. And, you know, we all become sharper thereby. And I think that's, you know, I think that is the difference. And I'm sure within her PhD program, some people were intellectuals and some were not, or became intellectuals. And, you know, again, within the theater, within any field of research, you know, within a field of politics or the arts, not everyone is going to be an intellectual.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, kind of being an expert, you get blinders on. You don't think of the big picture. You just think on one topic in particular. And
it's kind of one directional expertise. It comes from the expert. Yeah. I'd say also, you know, I'm thinking of a CBC documentary I heard in particular, or interview it was. But, you know, I think that another kind of false symptom of being intellectual, I think one of the things, it's emphasized more in subcultures than others, one of the concepts of being intellectual is that you're not motivated by money. Mm. And China is like this. The idea that if you're intellectual, you live in poverty. I mean, ancient Athens was like this to some extent. Different cultures to different extents. That, you know, and again, this comes back to, well, if you're in the theater, is it commercial? Is it for the audience? If you're a painter, are you a commercial painter? You can be a purely commercial, but you can be an illustrator, you know, drawing Batman comics, you know, because Batman pays you a lot better than this kind of thing. I think again that's actually really a false. There's some overlap there, but that doesn't make you an intellectual. The fact that you're not motivated by money, or the fact that what you produce as a researcher, as an artist, as a writer, as a political activist, because again, one of the things is you could just be an intellectual and just be directly trying to change the world through politics. The fact that it doesn't make money, I think, is utterly unrelated to whether or not you're an intellectual and whether or not your role in society is being a public intellectual. And if it does make money, if it happens to, I think that's also it doesn't put it this way, it does not invalidate your claim to be an intellectual if you happen to have made a lot of money out of doing whatever it is you're doing. So I think that's really profoundly unrelated. Yeah. But this goes back even to Socrates and so on, where part of he literally stood there defending his life in court, and part of what the big deal was, I didn't do this for money. I wasn't. I'm doing this. I'm doing this to awaken Athens from its slumber. I'm doing this to make men question what is virtue. Right. What is the meaning of life, and then to motivate them to be better people, and for our society to be a better society. That's his defense of himself, was I never accepted payment for this. Right? Yeah. So we will see. We will see if life makes a hypocrite out of me. But, we'll see if I manage to combine being a baker with being an intellectual.
There's going to be a lot of reasons. There are going to be a lot of excuses to not spend time, researching things independently. Yeah. And, sorry, this is like a personal note, but I guess I do want to, I keep going back to this idea because the making excuses thing. I think it was partly how, I guess the biggest influence of skepticism was my dad, because of he was never actually he would go to church, but he didn't want to, right? Yeah. He would criticize what I was learning in school, saying it was liberal, but he never provided an alternative, yeah. So, and also my mom was pretty ultra conformist type of person, so it kind of made this ideal for me is to be questioning but still conform, inside then you'll have these doubts, but just on the outside conform and don't just right. Don't let it influence you. So it was I didn't have that extra push, so I do think that is important to have some kind of alternative. And anyway, sorry, I know this is kind of off topic how I'm ending this, but
no, I think. What do you mean by an alternative? I think that's the tragedy of being an intellectual, right?
Right, exactly.
Most of the time, there is no alternative. You don't have an alternative to your school system. You don't have an alternative to your political system, or what have you. Yeah. You're often in the position of just criticizing this and pointing out what's wrong with it. Pointing out how terrible it is that people still circumcise their children. Yeah, people still milk, eat yogurt and so on. Right. And you don't. So I think that's part of it. Is that it may be largely or entirely destructive.
Yeah, but I do think it's important to continue doing that as we
right.
if we do
right.
If we do become bakers, and that becomes our full-time jobs.
Well, look, I think though this comes back to the theme of people kind of ridiculing one another for being intellectuals, mm-hmm. or seeming to be, or calling themselves intellectuals. Because our aims in life are extrinsic, but they're regarded as intrinsic by others. They're regarded as your identity. So, you bake bread for a living, so you are a baker. And then there are all these assumptions about that, who you are and what you do and so on. You've seen that. My ostensible job has changed from one month to the next. I have been a professor. And if you want to say that, if you want to say, oh, I'm a professor at a university in China, that may suggest certain things about you. And, there was a time when I told people, well, I am, involved with First Nations languages, Korean, Ojibwe, and this is what I'm studying, and these are the projects I'm trying to do. And there was another time when I was doing humanitarian work, and, another time when I introduced myself to people, and they said, what are you doing? I said, well, I've been doing research on stone inscriptions and palm leaf manuscripts in this ancient dead language. You know, I mean,
Yeah, but
so
like,
so these are aims. They're extrinsic. They're created by fleeting, bizarre circumstances, you know, that come and go. But who I am and what drives me as an intellectual has utterly, you know, remained the same.
yeah, right. And your reading isn't, your
Right.
intellectual pursuits aren't governed by what your
Right.
what your goals for making money are, you know, like earning money,
Right.
whatever your career was at the time, you know.
Right.
You were a professor, but you
Right.
were reading on the side things completely unrelated, or
Well, right. And my reading also wasn't limited the way yours was by the courses I took in college.
yeah, right. Well, just, I mean,
So
it just
even that,
recently,
right.
like you're reading up on Greek literature and you read
Yeah.
about the English Civil War. You know, you're not intending
Yeah.
to go into the
Right.
history of England. Like, you're
That's
not
right.
intending
That's right. That's right.
to get a master's
That's
in the
right.
classics.
Well, that's
You
right.
know,
But on the other hand,
and
I'm
it's not
also
motivated by
right.
money.
That's right.
You're
And
not.
it's not motivated by money, but it's also true that I'm not satisfied with what Aristotle describes as being a dilettante, with just only
Right.
learning to play the lute enough to be gratified by the sound of its music. You know what I mean? Like that's what Aristotle's about, is just, you know, getting a little bit of every color. So and you know, yeah. I mean,
I really admire that, and I think
Yeah.
there's a subset of people that do admire that, but I
Right.
think the more people would think about it in more realistic terms and think that you're wasting time, or like
Right.
that, you know, what's the point?
Right.
And
Right.
ultimately you have to
Right.
make it worth it. You have to make a point.
Right. Okay, but look. Okay, so I'm going to give two short answers to that, and then I'm going to hit the stop button here.
Yeah.
So what is the point? One answer, you know, you've heard from me before on this YouTube channel. The point is who I am. The point is who you want to be and who you want to become, right? And on some level, we all know that. I mean, it's shallow and it's deep at the same time.
Right.
Like what you read and what you care about and what kind of difference you're trying to make in the world, these things, they become who you are, and you become them in a very real sense.
Exactly.
If you sit on the couch and watch football and drink beer after work, you become sitting on the couch football watching motherfucker. That's who you are. It's not, you can't put that aside and say, oh no, that's not who I really am. That's
my true self.
You can't say that's not who I really am. That's just what I do in my free time. No,
you become what you do in your free time.
That is who you are, right? Or you could say your free time is exactly.
That's really hard to face up.
That's That's well, I think that's also what haunts intellectuals, right? I think that's part of what haunts you. So I mean, why try to learn Cree? It's not like I today can speak the Cree language fluently. Why try to learn Chinese? And why, I mean, within that, why care about Chinese politics and history in the kind of critical way that I do? Well, guess what? I get to be me. You know, like that's the final outcome, is that you know, it's not that this is something I do, that this is, you know, this is who I am. Yeah. And, you know, the other, you know, shallower question is this kind of reading, this kind of inquiry, self-criticism, how do you make it productive? How do you share with others? We've talked about that recently, where I said, hey, you know what? Instead of just reading a book, you can read 3 books and then, you know, read some articles about them, put together an article, you know, write an article, put it on the internet, so that you're making reading productive.
Yeah.
And maybe 5 other people are going to see that article. I mean, you're reading books, you're taking notes on them, you're making a YouTube video discussing them. Right. Maybe 50 people see that video. But I mean, you know, there are ways to make the reading productive, and there are ways to take your own conclusions out of the seclusion of an intellectual and subject them to the criticism and feedback of others, which, you know, it depends on your personality type. For some people, that's very important, because if they don't have that, they're going to end up, you know, in a echo chamber of their own, you know, delusions. Whatever. For some people, it's important. For other people, I think less so. Depends on how effectively you're self-critical or what have you. But sure, instead of, I mean, you know, is it accumulating knowledge for the sake of accumulating knowledge? I don't think the effect is really cumulative in that way. I mean, I think that's a misleading way to describe it for that reason. But then, you know, yes, you can make it productive in both senses. It is productive tragically, ineluctably, escapably, it's productive because ultimately the product is you. And then on the other hand, there are ways to make reading productive. There's ways to make learning productive and intellectual activity productive. And what you see now on YouTube, what you see now on my blog, in my publications, and so on, those are examples of how we try to make it happen. If you want to ask me a question, it's been a 1-hour answer to a question that I think was 1 sentence long from James. Support the channel for $1 a month on Patreon. Write to me. I'll probably write back. Or you may be horrified to have an hour-long video show up in your inbox one day.